Here we are again.
Welcome back to the Agree to Disagree podcast. I'm your host, Jason.
And I'm Robert.
And we're just going to springboard, piggyback, if you will, off of last week's episode, where I guess the content would be kind of labeled, "So You Voted for Trump." In fact, I think that was the name of the episode. So we'll just take it from there. So, Bobby, I'll let you kick us off here. Got any questions for me?
Well, you know, in the interest of getting both sides of it, you know, my thoughts throughout the week were, you know, I reflected on it a lot. And like I said before, I think one of the things I love about the conversations we've had over the years is it always gives me stuff to think about. And I think we both grow because of the conversations. I wanted to get your take more on, you know, what you've thought of what Trump's done so far, but also what were you hoping to see and what would have inspired you to vote the other direction, if you would, you know, like, because really, when it comes, like, I want to identify, or at least help people identify what issues we're bumping up against, really, and flesh them out, you know, like, how can we find middle ground? I mean, it's almost like we need to, I mean, we elect officials to do these things for us, but they, it doesn't seem like it's getting worked out. So, speaking of polarization, we've talked about that as really one of the existential threats of not just our society, but our species. Do you think Trump is a symptom or a cause of that division? And what kind of leadership would help us move past this era that we're in of political hostility?
Yeah. Okay. Pretty good questions here. Broad, lots of room for spreading my wings here. I think it's safe to say out of the gates that there's really nothing that the man could have done to influence me to vote towards him in this last election. By the point, I mean, let's keep in mind it's his second term, so it's an open book test, in my humble opinion. So I really don't feel as though there's anything he could have done that would have inspired me to vote for him. And it's based off of some of his policies from the first time around, but I mean, in my humble opinion, that was a shit show. And one thing I get a lot from people, and usually strangers that don't know me, whenever I say anything negative about the Trump administration or the man himself, whether it's in reference to the first time around or this time around, there's always a bringing up of either Barack Obama for some reason or Joe Biden. Usually any response to one of my shorts that might be easily labeled as anti-Trump is, "Oh yeah, so what do you think about Biden then?" In the context of whatever gripe I've got about the current administration. And I don't really get that. I mean, I do get that. And I guess that's the scary thing for me, is that's the binary thinking of a huge segment of our society. And within that, the notion is I must be pro-Biden, therefore I must be Democrat, I must be all of these things because I have disdain for our president, because I exercise my First Amendment right, which is to criticize, and that's primarily what that right is for, to be able to criticize the government and specifically the president. So I am not pro-Biden either. I think that was the second worst president in history. Not really. If I did more research, I would come up with some different answers to that. But he was not somebody that I admired. I don't think he did good things for us. So I'm just going to get that out of the way now. So if anyone is listening, and that's kind of the reflex of that binary thinking, is to go right towards, well, what about the Biden administration? Or for some reason, Barack Obama's brought up a lot as well.
I hope you'll notice I said the other way.
Yeah.
You know, I kind of knew that already about you, so it's not fair to our listeners. But, you know, I knew that you weren't specifically pro the other side, which is why I kind of implied not Trump, you know, instead of, and quick just reflection on what you're saying, not to interrupt, but what you've said it happens on both sides, and that's something I'm trying to. I even fight the urge to do it myself sometimes because it's not a. That's not what we're talking about.
It's not an argument, right?
Yeah, like
It's absolute fallacy.
Biden followers will go, well, what about Trump? And a lot of times their whole ideology is built on against Trump, as opposed to, and then you'll go, well, tell me something good that he did, or tell me something good that Kamala did, and Kamala, and it'll be radio silence. They don't know.
Yeah.
And it's like, we gotta learn more about this so that we can make educated decisions. And that's really my hope in this, is that we can make educated decisions together. But back to you.
Yeah. And in that context, I'll just follow that through. I'm also not somebody who would have voted for Ms. Harris. I'm not a fan of really any authority. And I know that sounds silly and it's a bit childish of me, but when I look at her track record as a prosecutor and the things that she was proud of and the things that she accomplished while serving in that role, not a fan of that. And that's a personal thing. But beyond that, looking at the more political aspect of the campaign, which is absolutely imperative to any decision making when you're voting, I'm not a fan of her politics in general. And I did feel as though it was just an extension of the prior presidency. And I did not want to vote for another Joe Biden, regardless of how pretty she is, how liberal she is, regardless of any of those things. I did not find her to be a viable candidate. So much as I find myself doing in these elections, I voted for somebody else. In this case, I went pretty much down the line with the Libertarian Party, which I don't like to do either. Not that I'm aligned with the Libertarian Party or any party, but the prior election I had voted for somebody who was not on the ballot. And this was a compromise inside of myself that I probably won't compromise on again. And I'm going to continue doing the old Jason Arnett MO, which is vote for who I actually want to be the leader of the free world. But that's neither here nor there. Back to the original point, really nothing that could have been done by Donald Trump in order for me to have voted for him. Again, open book test when you look at his prior presidency, it was not good. Now, of course, there was things within it that weren't awful. And I think that's safe to say with any leader in any position. Not every aspect of execution within the role is terrible. But I didn't like a lot of it. And I didn't like how a lot of it was done. I didn't like a lot of the claiming of credit for things that weren't actually associated with his execution. And I didn't like the spin he put on a lot of things that really just ended up trouncing on liberty. Not to the degree of this presidency, but close enough for discomfort. When I look back at the first presidency and you look at things, at first I was, as a 2A guy, a really big gun guy, a guy who's, built guns and sold guns and bought guns, and believes in guns for whatever that means. I think back to, if you remember bump stocks. You remember bump stocks?
I do.
Not exactly a huge part of the gun culture. Probably didn't even leak into the opposing side of the argument too much because it was more of a novelty. What a bump stock was this accessory that you could put onto a rifle, say an AR-15. It was a stock. For those that aren't gun people, the stock is the thing you hold on to when you're firing a rifle. It's the piece that you butt against your shoulder, but it's also the piece that you hold in your hand. So everything that's not the receiver or the barrel or the magazine or the grip. And this accessory allowed the gun to freely float in almost kind of a state of a sliding apparatus that ultimately resulted in the gun having a similar experience to a fully automatic weapon. So it would use this loose tolerance and the recoil and the jostling, for lack of a better term, that occurs when firing a rifle to reset the trigger and fire the trigger again without the finger ever being moved. So it was a really clever but silly workaround for the assault rifle ban, or the automatic weapons ban that happened in the 90s that prevented us from having machine guns. And it allowed a gun to behave in a very similar way. And why I bring that up, because Trump, again, is, like we discussed last episode, he is the leader of the Republican Party as well as the country. He is the executive of the Republican Party. And that party is pro-Constitution. And within the Constitution, we have several amendments, and the second one happens to be the right to bear arms. And this man decided to allow the left to make bump stocks, as silly and trivial as they are just a piece of plastic, and they are not anything that is against the Constitution or against any acts that were in legislation and that had been passed. And that's why they were legal. Controversial, fully understood, but completely within the realm of legality. And to be clear, very silly. But he went after those, and he made those illegal. Now, as a younger man, and I know that was only less than a decade ago, but I was a younger man technically, I was infuriated by that. It was just the first thing that Trump did that I thought was silly, stupid, and attacking our rights as Americans. And as a gun guy, I was mortified. Now, years later, as my ideology and my interpretation of it does, my opinions changed on that. I'm still not a big fan of that. I don't think that we should be policing gun accessories. Much like I don't believe we should be policing, chemicals that we put in our body. I'm very anti those things. But an older version of myself looks at that as something that was a negotiation. It was a compromise. It was something Trump gave to the left from the right, for lack of better, verbiage in that, as a token. And I thought, in hindsight, that was actually pretty diplomatic. I'm not sure if that was his intent, but that's how I ultimately ended up interpreting it. So not everything from the prior presidency am I fully opposed to and pissed off about, is I guess what I'm saying. Now, when it comes to this particular election, again, he'd already shown us not only how he interprets and executes his belief of the Constitution and as the leader of the Republican Party, but he did it with such fury, such polarizing vitriol for all of his opponents, that I just was disgusted at the lack of diplomacy that we could have labeled his last presidency. And I knew for a fact we were going to get more of that if we elected him again. I also saw the country at each other's throats to a degree in which I had never seen in my 45 years. So I was actually very afraid of him being elected, but not maybe even as much as I was of him not being elected because of what we saw the last time around that he didn't get the vote. So I was nervous about it, but frankly, there was nothing that could have been done to change the fact that I did not vote for him. So I don't know. And I guess as we go further into this discussion, we can talk about some of the things that he's doing that I am so deadly opposed to. And also some things that I think he can still do differently within his time as the leader of the free world to keep this thing from sliding off the rails completely. Although many of us think that's already happened. But to answer the question boldly and simply, there's nothing the man could have done. He ruined it the first time around. And he's just not the kind of man that I believe should be in any position of leadership, quite frankly.
There's been a lot of information dispersed, and there's been a lot of moves in rapid succession. And a lot's happened over the last 5 years. And I go down that path because you brought up the bump stocks, and some of us have forgotten about that.
Yeah.
But
it was seemingly trivial. Even
that being
even
said, with the way that information is dispersed, do you think the powers that be, not just Trump, but the powers that be have, with the way people perceive truth and reality and how easily it's manipulated by emotion and tribalism, do you think the powers that be that have weaponized that emotional, because it's easy to say one side did it, it's easy to say the other. I think there's been a weaponization of our feelings and our want to be right.
Yeah.
What is your stance on that?
I think it's been commoditized. And I think that's just a natural progression of the information age that we're in, the technology age, the AI age, the social media age. But I also think that it's something that all people in power are aware of, whether it's subconsciously or fully consciously like Trump is. And it is ran with as if it's a tactic. It's a tactical use of rhetoric that is amplified to an alarming degree through the lens of social media in particular, but just media at large. So yeah, no, it's prevalent more so than I think it's ever been. It's always existed. But the way that the internet is able to cascade it and fire it like a high intensity particle beam into our hearts and our minds is something that's certainly being used consistently as the primary tactic of nearly every person in influential positions or positions of authority.
Well, and this is almost fodder for another episode, but since we're talking, about, obviously Trump is most recently guilty of just that. But you talk about Zuckerberg and what he did with Facebook, and then what was happening with Twitter before Musk bought it and made it X. And I find it really hard to trust the information, even preparing to, continue this dialogue. I'm like, well, what has Trump done? What hasn't he done? And what's valid here? It's hard to find the truth anymore. You almost have to swim through miles of trash to find the actual good stuff that you're looking for.
Sure.
That's so
everybody's a journalist too. I mean, not only do you have the massive amount of what we would call actual news, and what that means these days is pretty subjective, but news that's coming from a news organization or a journalist, that's at an all-time high, just the volume of it. I also feel as though whether it's just due to Trump's stance on the media or due to the individuals within the media becoming a bit more on the activist side, I mean that's becoming rhetoric in and of itself as well. Like legitimate journalism, NPR is a good example. My favorite news network. I feel within it rhetoric. You know what I mean? Not to the degree of propaganda, but there's enough opinion embedded in the tone and the delivery of the content for me to understand just at a glance, at a listen, that organization is not supportive of the president, which it shouldn't be supportive, or again, it should be objective. But I guess what I'm trying to say is even within professional news delivery, I feel as though there is much more subjectivity to it than there should be. But in addition to that, every freaking body's a journalist, right? I mean, I have no credentials in this world, and I certainly won't claim myself to be anything. I'm no influencer, I'm no journalist, but I do put my opinions out there, and I do it, through a camera and a script and a microphone. So to somebody who's maybe not as informed and just looking at me at face value, they might take my opinions more seriously than they should be taken, because they are just that, my opinions. And people like me are out there, and a lot of them put themselves at a news desk, put on a suit and tie, put an American flag in the background, on the chroma key green screen, and really try their best to look like a news organization. So it's tough to sift through all of that and, to your point, find the truth, because the internet is just full of opinions. And I don't even know what is journalism anymore.
Well, and we're not journalists, you're right. And our hopes in this podcast is not to report the news. I'll make that clear. Really, if we're talking about news, we're really reacting to things we've seen, and we're inviting dialogue from our listeners to say, hey, here's this, because I said it at work yesterday. There was a topic brought up where more resources were offered in a particular thing we were studying. And I was like, I'm always about more resources. I'm a research nerd. I love to dig. I love to look and learn. But what we are professionals at is communication. Having spent years in retail and sales,
in the communication sector,
and communication.
Yeah.
So I would say our hopes in this podcast, again, just to reiterate, is to help people learn to communicate about these things. And part of communication is learning what is real, what is right, what is true, and helping people get to that information as well. Now, since we're talking about Trump, and Trump is he's captaining the ship right now, for lack of a better way of saying that. What could he do? What could he how could he communicate more responsibly to hopefully mend this divide? Like what could he? What would you like to see?
Yeah, it's a good question, and I think it requires some drastic changes to behavior. Start, stop, and continue kind of conversation here. But before I even go that route, I will get a few things out of the way. In this current administration, again, much like with any president, not everything is something that I am fully opposed. There's a good example is that the criminal justice and clemency changes, some of the reform from a incarceration perspective. Our culture in this country is surrounding incarceration and the rehabilitation prison system. It's very punitive. I was speaking with a professional yesterday, somebody who's professionally in the world of psychology as it pertains to those that are trying to get back on their feet. Over some maybe getting through some legal barriers, drug-related stuff, crime-related stuff. She had a good perspective, and what she basically told me was that our criminal system, our justice system, is very punitive, but it expects you to be very much behaving as though it's a rehabilitative process, a reformation process, a process of getting back on your feet and, healing, so to speak, to get back into the good graces of society and become a contributing member of society. That's the expectation, but what it is very punitive. It's very black and white. Now, one thing that Trump has done is he's done a bit to reform that. He's given judges all the way up to the top a bit more ability to have discretion through their delivery of sentences and interpretation of the laws, which I think is good. Judges are elected to those positions because they're very trustworthy, they're very objective people, and they very much bleed the Constitution, and their interpretation of it is something they take extremely seriously. They're a special breed of people, in my opinion, and to give them a bit more leeway and a bit more credence to run their courts in a way that is flexible, in a way to correspond with the fact that we're dealing with individuals, while not straying into the territory of favoritism or potential conflicts of interest. I thought that was a great thing that Trump was championing there. And if you look into some of those reforms, it's ubiquitous that it's a good thing. It was bipartisan. It's something that both sides can really sign off on, and really I don't see any bad coming from it. I think that there has been some earmarks and things attached to those notions that maybe serve that right-wing rhetoric a bit more than I would like it to, but at its heart, I think that that's one thing that he's done a good job of. And I'll be perfectly frank with you, that might be the only thing that comes to my mind right now as far as things that I can say definitively that I advocate that Trump was behind. To answer your question, though, what could he do differently going forward to get this thing back on the rails? Man, I'll tell you, it would have to be. I was thinking about this question actually, and it reminds me of A Christmas Carol. When Ebenezer Scrooge is visited overnight by these three ghosts, and this traumatic experience of being ripped out of bed and into this interdimensional nightmare of visiting the past, present, and the future. And I mean, I'll say this, it will have to involve something to that degree of nearly supernatural intervention in order for things to look differently for me. And I don't want to be overly dramatic, but when you've done as much damage to Americans' trust as Trump has done, and I know when I say that, I'm representing a small portion of America. It's me, right? But I think I'm smart enough to say that there's at least half the country that feels the way that I do. This man is awful. Now, I'm smart enough to know the other half of the country, to varying degrees, whether it's half or not, is very much the opposite. They very much support what he's doing. So I guess to appease them, very little, if anything, needs to be done. To appease the rest of us, it would have to be something that is nearly supernatural in order to achieve. But realistically speaking, what can we do starting now? First of all, we've got to give him the microphone less often, because a big part of the issue I've got with the man is his delivery. Aside from policies and executing within the parameters of his role as the leader of the free world, the commander-in-chief, just the way he conducts himself, he is clearly, in every motion and every word, he is trying to connect with half of the country at the expense of the other half of the country's experience. And that is not diplomacy. That is the opposite of what I would expect from somebody whose sole purpose is to represent our country and its collective values as one. So I think giving him the microphone less often would be a good way to start. Let's get some people in positions that know how to speak to Americans and know how to do it and deliver messages in a way that doesn't piss off half the country every time the mouth is opened. Does that make sense?
Oh, absolutely. That's something I was thinking about on the way over here. And I have a good example of it. Like I said, we have a sales background.
Yeah.
One of the things we know as good salespeople, we don't need to talk ill about our competition to sell our products.
Let alone saying 3 times in one sentence how much he hates them.
Right, right. So an example would be like if we were to be like, our podcast is the greatest. You don't even need to listen to other podcasts because other podcasts are trash.
You don't even need to listen to my podcast to know it's the greatest.
Yeah, yeah. There's no other podcast like this out there ever. Never has been, never will be. We're the greatest. And that other podcast that sounds like ours, they're just not cool. Yeah, that is not how we talk. It's not something that we should. And I'd like to see more diplomacy in the what are you doing for us? And it shouldn't. It actually plays off of what we were talking about just a little bit earlier, and that when people come up and you mentioned that you voted one side or the other, the inclination is to go, yeah, but what did they do? You know, and it's like he's playing. It's almost like he's playing off of that.
Well, he knows it's a phenomenon that exists at the very surface of the American, psychology, and he definitely runs with it. He's not dumb.
Right.
I know there's a lot of people that will take exception to that. That could be a hot take these days, that President Trump is not dumb. But, I mean, we, as flawed as we are as people, we didn't vote in a complete idiot. We just voted in somebody that doesn't necessarily represent us in a way that has ever been exhibited before.
I think people are gonna. I think people would be better served to just list, like, really. The divide is so great at this point. We need to list what we're voting against and compromise. It's like, well, I don't want this. Yeah, well, I don't want this. Okay, no. What are you willing? Are you willing to give me this for this? Because it is that divisional at this point. Yeah. It is that divided.
Well, that's why I brought up the bump stocks, because I thought, in retrospect, that is a good example of him in that rare moment being diplomatic.
Yeah,
It upset me in the time, but usually in negotiation, you don't walk away from it feeling, at least one side feels better than the other side, but you don't feel whole because you compromise.
Right.
And I in retrospect, again, I think that was a good and rare example of his ability to be diplomatic and to foster compromise. Although it was not something taken from the gun community. It was something that he himself just decided to do. And not that he has to consult with us or me as a gun guy, but I didn't feel as though it represented us at all. And it was an odd thing, but nonetheless, a great example of how he can execute diplomacy within the role that he's in. But to expand upon my answer towards, what can he do differently, aside from shutting up and stop being such a, for lack of a better term, a dick all the time intentionally, let's look at the Constitution. Let's really start making sure everything that we're doing as a president is in alignment with the Constitution, as opposed to how can we get around this problem that is the Constitution. And I mentioned that last episode, that from my perspective, it seems as though the Constitution is a problem for Donald Trump. And I want him to look at it as the foundation, the fabric of the reality that is America. And I want him to run his administration and policies through that lens. And when I see things like due process being taken from anyone on American soil, specifically what I'm referring to is this major, violent, and militarized expulsion of undocumented aliens or citizens, whatever we want to call that segment of society, the way that they are being treated by this administration without due process, as if the Constitution does not apply to them at all. And let's be clear, it does. It is not a document that is written just for people born on our soil or Americans that have gone through the naturalization process. The Constitution applies to every human being that is on our soil. And these people are clearly being treated in a way that defies that. It goes completely against that. And somebody said a meme on social media just a few days ago regarding this. What if it was you that wasn't given due process and we're just told it's time to go? Now, due process is there so that if you do have papers, or if you do have an argument, if you do have some exception that is to be made, or just evidence to furnish to show that, no, I should be here. The due process part of this whole thing is your opportunity as the accused to give those documents. And to be clear, what Trump is doing is removing that aspect from the equation. So I'm sure some of the folks that are being asked to leave, or drug out by their ear, I'm sure that they are here illegally by the laws that are on the books. But we don't know that because there's no due process to prove that one way or another. And I can't think of a way to describe that anti-American sort of sentiment more so than that. They are being robbed of the one thing the Constitution is here to do, and that is provide us all an opportunity to have a voice and to be treated fairly and with equity. So I think whatever it goes into him getting back to being somebody who represents this country through the lens of the Constitution, that's what we need to have happen. The trouble I have is that I don't think that that is possible. He's in opposition of the Constitution. He said that during the first weeks of this term, that there's things about it he doesn't like and he wants to change. And I know I'm paraphrasing, but it doesn't take a lot of effort to go back and see that and to watch that video clip and to hear him and see his lips say those things. It is evident he does not care for many aspects of the Constitution. And if I had to wager a guess, because he's not clear when he says these things, my guess would be the parts of the Constitution that he takes exception to are the ones that get in the way of him doing whatever the fuck he wants to do. And I find that to be something that is completely unacceptable for anyone in a position of government leadership, least alone the President of the United States of America. So again, going back to the supernatural intervention that would have to take place in order for me to think that this man is on the right track. I mean, there is he would have to become a different person under like, I don't know. I mean, I cannot even imagine him behaving in a way that would get this thing back on the rails. I just can't.
As I'm listening to you, I do want to touch on for those of us who voted for Trump, I think there's more, or I hope there's more like me, that it was mentioned when he was running that he was going to go after the illegals, but
absolutely
it was not mentioned, or at least it was overlooked by a lot of us, that was going to impact the illegals that, we were used to having here, for lack of a better way of putting that, he
didn't mention that he was going to be plucking people off of college campuses for speaking out against, say, Israel. Those things weren't mentioned. And why would they?
Well, the reason I bring that up is just because, again, the hopes of this dialogue is that we can look at each other and know, there's more to me than a guy who voted for Trump.
Oh, absolutely.
There's more
to me than a guy who makes stupid videos on the internet saying how much he does not like this administration. I also like science. I post those videos too.
Yeah. I watch those videos too. Cool. So that being said, I really just wanted to make sure that people are aware that as we're talking, this is more than just political discourse. This is us trying to cut to the heart of what's going on And we'll continue to do that in the weeks to come. And we thank you for tuning in. And we invite you to like, subscribe, comment. Tell us what we did wrong. Tell us what we did right. We love all the above.
Yeah, tell us what you want to hear from us. What are some topics that you think would be good for two middle-aged white guys from Iowa that are sitting in Hyperspace Studio right now? What are some things you want to hear from us? Beyond that, thank you again. I love seeing the viewership taking off a little bit on the podcast.
Yeah, thank you.
This is episode 3, and my hope is that it finds more ears than the last 2, because that's the current trend. And we'll look forward to having another conversation next week. Until then, thank you for tuning in to Agree to Disagree and Still Be Friends. I'm your host, Jason Arnett.
I'm Robert Blake.
And we will see you next time. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.